She only wanted to rinse off the sweat of a long day, but a broken lock, a wrong turn, and a hallway filled with powerful strangers led her straight into the center of the most elite gathering in New York. Standing breathless in nothing but a hotel towel, Elena Moore had no idea that in the next 10 minutes her entire life would be rewritten. The hotel lobby still echoed with the fading footsteps of guests dressed in tuxedos and gowns, their laughter muffled behind the velvet ropes of exclusivity as Elena rushed down the back corridor, barefoot, her hair still damp from the shower steam, and her arms tightly gripping the edge of the white towel wrapped around her slender body. She had only planned to freshen up quickly after preparing the penthouse suite for the night's exclusive event, but the bathroom lock jammed unexpectedly, and in her panic, she found herself exiting through the wrong door that opened straight into the ballroom. The golden chandeliers above cast warm light onto marble floors and crystal glasses. The buzz of high society vibrated around her as her presence sliced through the room like a gust of wind. Heels clicked to a halt, champagne flutes paused mid-air, and 100 eyes turned not out of malice but of pure, stunned disbelief. Among them stood one man in tailored black, his gaze unreadable, jaw clenched and glass untouched. Marcus Blackwell, the elusive billionaire whose name alone could sway market tides and melt headlines with his silence. Now his eyes fixed not on the senators or heiresses that surrounded him, but on the trembling girl wrapped in terry cloth who had just stumbled into his world. Elena's heart pounded louder than the soft classical music echoing through the speakers. She had no voice, no words, just the raw truth of being seen, stripped of armor, status, or preparation, vulnerable in every way. Yet, she didn't run. She froze instead, held in place not just by fear but by something in Marcus's gaze that felt strangely safe, like recognition, like a whisper from a different life. He lifted one hand calmly and spoke, not to her, but to the room. "This is Elena, my guest for the evening." His voice was low, steady, final. Gasps rolled through the crowd as waiters resumed motion and conversations restarted, more cautious now, but Elena could barely hear. Over the blood rushing in her ears, a security guard approached quietly, offering a robe, and Marcus nodded before stepping toward her himself, his presence taller than she imagined, more grounded. He reached out, but didn't touch. Simply offered his suit jacket without a word. She took it, slipping her arms into the expensive fabric and whispering, "Thank you," though she barely managed the sound. He leaned closer then, his voice a soft shield against the room. "I figured you'd prefer walking out with dignity than hiding behind guards." She nodded, unsure of everything except that his eyes weren't mocking her. They were studying her, not for what she looked like, but for why she was here. That night she did not sleep, not because of the embarrassment which should have consumed her, but because something about Marcus's gaze lingered in her mind, and not even shame could erase it from her memory. A man who had the world at his feet had chosen to protect her instead of ridicule her, and in doing so had planted a question in her chest, one that pulsed louder than her regret. What does someone like him see in someone like me? She did not know that her fate had already begun to bend like a flame meeting wind, and by morning nothing would be the same again. Elena Moore had grown up learning how to blend into the background, raised by her grandmother in a quiet corner of Brooklyn. After her mother vanished without a trace when she was only 7, she had learned to survive with silence and small dreams. Now 22. Elena worked as a housekeeper at the Rosemont Grand Hotel, the most exclusive 5-star hotel on Manhattan's Upper East Side. It was a place where the rich played games behind velvet curtains, and girls like her disappeared into service corridors with laundry carts and name tags. Despite her modest life, Elena carried herself with a quiet grace that some mistook for aloofness, but it was just caution learned from watching the world reward cruelty and punish kindness. Her days were long, spent changing linens, folding towels with perfect creases, and scrubbing marble floors that would never belong to her. Her nights were lonelier, often curled beside her father's hospital bed, whispering stories to him as if her voice alone could delay the cancer tightening around his lungs. The doctors had given him 6 months, but she fought every day to buy him more time with overtime shifts and borrowed hope. The Rosemont was her only lifeline, and she clung to it like a shipwrecked soul clutching driftwood. The hotel staff knew her as the girl who never complained, who worked double shifts without hesitation, who never missed a single checklist. And yet, no one really knew Elena, not even herself. Beneath the crisp uniform and tied-back hair lived a girl who used to dream of being a dancer, of painting on rooftops and kissing someone just because it felt right. But those pieces of her had been locked away, sacrificed in exchange for hospital bills and reality. On the other side of the world she served, Marcus Blackwell was born into gold and shadow, the son of real estate magnate Calvin Blackwell and fashion icon Celeste Marin. Marcus had known wealth before he understood what it meant. His childhood was filled with airports and security teams, piano tutors and photo ops. He was expected to inherit the world, and he did, but never on his own terms. After a scandal rocked the Blackwell empire when he was 19, Marcus took over the company prematurely, turning it into a technology and investment giant, leaving behind fashion runways and family headlines. He had a reputation for being cold, impossible to reach, and yet undeniably magnetic. Women chased him, not for love, but for legacy, for power, for the fantasy of touching something untouchable. But Marcus kept his walls high and his circle narrow. Only a few close associates and his loyal assistant Vivian knew what kept him awake at night. No one knew that behind the glass tower he ruled from was a man still haunted by the final words of his mother. Before she died in a plane crash, she had told him that love was the only currency that never devalued, and yet Marcus had never spent it, never trusted it, until the girl in the towel stumbled into his ballroom. The night after the party, Elena sat in her shared apartment unable to sleep, her mind replaying the moment Marcus had shielded her. She had expected to be fired, maybe even sued, but instead she was summoned to the penthouse the next morning. Nerves twisted in her stomach as she pressed the elevator button, heart thudding against her ribs. When the doors opened, Marcus stood there alone. No lawyers, no cameras, just him in a soft gray sweater and bare feet. He gestured for her to come in, and against all logic, she did. The room smelled like coffee and rain, sunlight spilling across the sleek wood floor. She stood frozen while he poured 2 cups and handed one to her, his voice calm and low. "I made it clear you were my guest last night, but people will talk unless we give them something to talk about." Her brows furrowed as she asked what that meant, and then came the sentence that knocked the air from her lungs. "Let's make it official. Be my girlfriend. For 3 months, public only. A contract." Elena choked on her sip, thinking it was a joke. But Marcus laid out the terms without flinching. 3 months, public appearances, 1 shared narrative, and in return, he would cover her father's full treatment and make a private donation to any charity of her choice. He watched her wrestle with pride and desperation, his voice softer now. "I know it sounds insane, but last night you saved me more than you know." Elena stared at him, the man who had every reason to ignore her, yet stood offering something more dangerous than money, a deal that came with invisible strings tied not to wealth, but to herself. It wasn't about pretending to be his girlfriend. It was about letting herself be seen, really seen. For the first time in years, she said yes, not out of hope, but necessity, and as she signed her name on the contract, her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the sense that nothing in her life would ever be small again. The days that followed felt like walking on glass. Elena found herself thrust into a world where her footsteps echoed against marble floors, and every glance felt measured and weighted. Marcus introduced her to the world as his partner at a gala for tech innovation 3 days after their agreement, and in that room filled with camera flashes, wine glasses, and whispered gossip, she stood beside him wearing a rented gown that hugged her body like borrowed confidence. Marcus didn't touch her unnecessarily, didn't lean in for staged affection. Yet the way his hand hovered just close enough to hers, the way his voice dropped slightly when he spoke only to her, made her feel like she was drowning in a warmth she couldn't afford. They practiced their story, how they met, how it was instant, a spark at a hotel bar, a shared joke, a late-night walk. They rehearsed smiles and glances in front of the mirror in his penthouse, which had now become a space she visited regularly, not because of the contract, but because he asked her to come, stay for dinner, watch a movie, review public schedules. Slowly those excuses blurred, and soon Elena found herself sitting cross-legged on his couch in oversized sweaters, eating takeout while Marcus reviewed merger proposals on his laptop beside her. Yet, in private, things were even more dangerous. He never pushed, never crossed boundaries, but the tension built like static. She'd feel it when he passed her a cup of tea and his fingers brushed hers, when they watched old French films and their shoulders touched in silence. It was there when she walked barefoot across the cold floors of his penthouse early one morning and saw him asleep on the couch, face softened in sleep, breathing steady, hand still holding the last page of a book he'd fallen asleep reading. She didn't know when she began to crave those quiet moments more than anything else. Maybe it was the way he looked at her like she wasn't out of place, or how he remembered her father's check-up dates and texted her, after each one asking how it went. Maybe it was how he had a playlist of Nina Simone and Sam Cooke that played in the background while they worked in silence, or how he once told her she made the silence less heavy. But feelings weren't in the contract, and Elena reminded herself of that every day. She reminded herself that his world was titanium and hers was cotton. He had elevators with security codes, and she had a key that stuck in the lock. He had headlines and influence, and she had a hospital bill taped to her fridge. She didn't belong in his world, and yet she didn't feel like a guest anymore. The more time they spent together, the harder it was to separate the act from reality. The media attention grew as their appearances multiplied. Tabloids speculated about her background. Influencers tried to uncover her past. Someone even leaked a photo of her childhood home, and Elena felt the walls closing in. But Marcus stepped in, not just with money or lawyers, but with something deeper. When she cried in the guest room one night, overwhelmed by the invasion of her privacy, he sat beside her silently, didn't ask her to stop, didn't try to fix it. He just let her lean against him until her sobs turned into breathing. He told her about his mother, how she taught him that people often weaponize curiosity when they can't control a narrative. He promised her they would weather it together, but what scared Elena more than the press was how easy it was to believe him, to lean into that sense of safety, of belonging. Then came the moment that shifted everything. They were attending a charity ball hosted by one of Marcus's investors. She wore a deep blue dress with a low back, and he, in a midnight suit with no tie, looked like he belonged in every painting ever made of men who ruled cities. They danced, barely speaking, just moving in rhythm while chandeliers sparkled above them, and when the music slowed, he whispered something into her ear that she couldn't forget. He said, "Sometimes I forget it's not real." Elena didn't answer. She couldn't, because her heart had been saying the same thing for days. That night, they returned to the penthouse, and for the first time, Elena didn't go to the guest room. Instead, she stood by the window overlooking the city lights, barefoot in his jacket, while he poured 2 glasses of wine and turned on Nina Simone. They talked about the charity, about their pasts, about nothing and everything, and when she leaned into him, he didn't move away. His hand rested lightly on her back, and when she looked up, their lips were so close, it felt like gravity did the rest. The kiss wasn't staged, wasn't practiced. It was quiet and unsure, but real, and when they pulled apart, neither said a word, because words couldn't undo what their hearts already knew. They slept in the same bed that night, but nothing happened beyond the sharing of breath and warmth, and the stillness of 2 people, scared of what they'd started. From then on, things changed, subtly at first. He'd touch her lower back as they walked through crowds. She'd reach for his hand when she felt nervous. He'd leave notes on the kitchen counter when he had early meetings, and she'd make him tea before bed. These weren't in the contract, but they became the rules they followed anyway. And yet, the deeper they fell, the louder the clock ticked. 3 months had never felt so short. And Elena felt the dread settle like winter on her chest. She didn't know what Marcus wanted beyond the contract, and she was too afraid to ask. Afraid that if she reached for more, she'd lose everything, including the version of herself that he made her believe in. But things couldn't stay simple, not in Marcus's world. And when his ex-fiancée Amelia returned from Europe and photos of them from the past surfaced in the media, it was as if the world tilted. Amelia was perfect, statuesque, a model-turned-philanthropist. The press called her Marcus's true match, and suddenly Elena's presence beside him looked like a fantasy again. She asked him if he still had feelings for Amelia, and Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he said, "I never loved her the way I look at you." But that wasn't an answer, and the silence that followed began to widen between them. To make things worse, the board of Blackwell Industries began questioning Marcus's focus, citing distraction and public drama. Elena felt like she was undoing the stability he'd built, and guilt poisoned her joy. She told him one night that maybe it was time to end the contract early, that maybe she had served her part, and now it was better for them both to return to their lanes. Marcus stared at her, pain evident in his eyes, and he whispered, "Is that what you want?" She couldn't answer because her heart was screaming no, while her fear whispered yes. So she left, packed her things while he stood silently in the doorway, not stopping her, maybe because he thought it was what she needed, maybe because he was too afraid to ask her to stay if it wasn't in the contract. And as the elevator doors closed between them, Elena knew she had just walked away from something that might never come again. Elena found herself trapped between two worlds, the world of shadows, where her father lay fighting for life, and the world glittering above, where she was expected to pretend and perform. When she arrived at the hospital that morning, her white dress uniform felt like armor. She had grown thin on purpose. It was the armor that kept her from collapsing in the face of bad news. Doctors said the cancer had spread and time was running out. She taped her trembling fingers to stop them from slipping off the ventilator button and prayed silently that Marcus would keep his promise. That evening she found him waiting in the penthouse kitchen barefoot, his presence calm, familiar, yet distant. The contract lay on the countertop, unopened. She knew what followed: the routine, the rehearsals, the appearance. But tonight felt different. She looked at him, eyes damp collar, stiff from fatigue, and whispered, "I'm spiraling." He didn't blink. He reached out, took her hand, and said, "Trust me." They went together to the gallery where he had once taken her, the place now empty but filled with memory. He led her to the sculpture made of torn pages and said, "This is where you saved me." She shook her head, unable to speak, and he continued, "You rebuilt me from broken parts, and tonight I need you to know the weight of truth." He drew a deep breath, then told her he found documents linking his father's company to the buyout that destroyed her mother's small clinic. Her mother had died broken because she could not treat patients once she saved. He gave them hope, and it was stripped away in boardroom deals that Marcus's father had signed off on. He paused. Her tears fell softly as he said, "I can't change the past, but I can change what comes next. I'm giving it all up, everything I inherited, this empire, everything that ties me to his name. I'm giving it away to start over with you." She stared at him, the man who had tried to protect her from this, but now was offering to stand with it. He handed her a full envelope. Inside was a draft of resignation letter, a plan for a new foundation, focusing on community health. He said, "Let's build this together, away from the chaos, away from the headlines, away from the sins of the past." That night, Elena cried for the first time since her father fell asleep. She cried because the weight of the world she carried was seen and acknowledged. She cried because love that didn't demand payment existed. She cried because he chose to walk away from everything, to walk toward her. In the following days, Elena began visiting the clinic her mother once ran. It was closed in disrepair. But she saw possibility. She called volunteers, students, local nurses, and asked for help. Marcus emailed contractors, accountants. Somebody cut a check to reopen the doors. He refused to let anyone call it charity. He insisted it was a partnership between two people who believed in healing as love. Meanwhile, Marcus faced his family and the board. He stepped before investors, stockholders, shareholders, and read a letter announcing his resignation. He spoke with quiet conviction, saying that legacy wasn't just a name, it was responsibility, and responsibility starts by holding yourself to your values. He watched as reporters scribbled notes, as his assistants blinked in disbelief, as his father's portrait in the boardroom framed his head like a halo or a target. They left him without applause or shame, just the sound of contracts dissolving and chairs scraping. Elena stood beside him in that room, her hand on his back. They left together out the glass doors into the night, and she didn't have to wear a dress or be anyone but herself. There, he kissed her softly and she whispered, "We're doing it." They kissed with no stage, no contract, no witnesses, just two people building something more fragile, more real than any empire. When they reopened the clinic 4 months later, it was small but bright. Clean walls, newly painted waiting rooms filled with sun and scattered toys. Volunteers and nurses smiled through tears. Patients lined up, grateful for care. They prayed for a miracle. and Elena said, "This is it." She looked at Marcus by her side, and he squeezed her hand, and they started the first treatment, never mentioning billion-dollar deals, never showing what was lost, only showing what was not. During the ribbon-cutting ceremony, a small framed photo hung in the lobby. Elena in a towel-cropped head, just a detail Marcus asked for it. She said yes because it's how it all started. The photo wasn't flashy, but it held the collision of two worlds, a girl stripped, naked, of armor, and a man stripped, naked, of legacy, now standing together in purpose. They moved into a small brownstone, above a bookstore, lived on second-hand furniture and thrifted rugs, weekends. They sat on the porch, drinking coffee and reading stories to kids who once sat in hospital halls. They kept contracts in drawer and love in full view. One evening, Elena found a letter in an envelope slid under their door. It was from Marcus's father, the big man who had lost an empire. He wrote about regrets, about love and pride. He explained his actions and apologized, leaving his entire personal fortune to the foundation they started. He wrote love never bound by blood or title. He wrote, "Maybe you two taught me more than I taught you." Elena looked at Marcus reading aloud in the dim porch light and said, "We changed his fate too." He nodded and kissed her forehead. Life felt slow, like salt waves in a quiet bay, but it was full, and it was theirs. And late at night, when they lay wrapped in worn quilt, they whispered about days ahead, about new clinics, new towns, new healing. He would brush her hair, and she would trace the scars on his hands. She would smile and say, "I didn't break you. You saved me without knowing it." He would say, "I found myself only after I found you." They never forgot the night she crashed a CEO's party in a towel, because it rewrote their lives. It didn't start with love. It started with survival and ended with purpose. And purpose was the strongest form of love they ever knew. Elena stared at the news on her phone that morning. The headlines called it a scandal, a betrayal, the girlfriend's sudden disappearance, the billionaire stepping down for love. Her heart raced as she scrolled through the details. They hinted at court filings and boardroom battles, and all she could see was Marcus's face slumped in an empty conference room. She dropped the phone onto her unmade bed and sank beside it, the weight of their choices pressed into her lungs. He came to the clinic that afternoon, barefoot, in paint-splattered jeans, and a black t-shirt that read, "Hope is action." He kissed the top of her head as she wiped sweat from her forehead together. They paused, and she wrapped her arms around him, his cheek pressed to hers. She whispered, "Is it worth it?" And he whispered back every second. Later that evening, he led her to Blackwell Tower, a building she had never visited in weeks. The halls were quiet, except for the low hum of security scanners and distant typing. They passed modern art pieces and closed office doors, and finally stopped before a polished mahogany door with a golden nameplate. She knew what awaited behind it. The boardroom where his father waited. Marcus didn't knock. He just pushed it open and entered the room with her close behind him. The board members sat around a long table, expressions curt and faces pale. The chairman rose without greeting. Marcus cleared his throat and said, "Thank you for coming." Everyone's eyes turned to Elena. She stood quietly, a stranger in a realm that had tried to control her. The chairman resumed his chair and said, "We are here to discuss the future of Blackwell Industries. This company can't be run by someone distracted by charity." A man in the front row snorted and said, "Would you interrupt God's legacy for a girl who barely had a home?" Marcus stepped forward, his voice sure, "And even that girl built every hospital bed and clinic room." She squeezed his hand in the gallery. She held his hand at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. "She is not a distraction. She is the reason I want to change what this company stands for." He turned to the chairman and said, "I am resigning effective, immediately. And I am donating my holdings and my shares to the foundation, Elena's Foundation for Health and Hope." He spread his arms slightly. "There is your future and there is mine. One built on healing, not profit." Gasps echoed across the room. The chairman's face twisted in anger and disbelief. He started to shout. His words fell flat against Marcus's calm voice. He laid out the story of Elena's mother, the closed clinic, the buyer's betrayal. He recounted board minutes showing his father's hand in the takeover that killed lives. He explained how he had discovered the documents only after she left him. He said, "This foundation is their future," and his apology in action. He ended by saying, "I won't build an empire on broken lives, and I hope you understand." Silence filled the room as the board swiveled in their chairs one by one. They nodded, some with resignation, some with resolve. The chairman looked at Elena, her tear-stained face framed by hair falling loose. He cleared his throat and said, "The resignation is accepted, and the foundation will receive the shares. Congratulations, Dr. Moore." The title echoed, "Wrong yet. Right, she is not a CEO." Her title wasn't official yet, but in that room, in that moment, she became something else. Marcus reached for her hand and guided her out into the hallway, away from stares and whispers. He pressed her forehead and said, "You are everything." He didn't need to add more, because she understood with powerful clarity that the sacrifice was mutual. He took less so she could have more, and in that act they had rewritten not just their futures, but their pasts as well. As they left the tower together, his assistants burst forward with flowers and cameras, but Marcus held Elena close. He whispered, "Let's go home." The word sounded like a kingdom, not a building. She nodded, and they walked out into the dusk. Hand in hand, a man giving up a legacy to build one together, with the woman who stepped in with a towel. They returned to their small clinic, and clinic lights glowed softly through tinted windows inside. Patients waited, and doctors shook their heads at miracles already happening. Elena and Marcus walked through smiling faces, warm hellos, and hopeful eyes. She squeezed his hand, and he squeezed hers. Returned together, they had crossed a line between two worlds and found a path that belonged to both. That night, they stood on the clinic roof beneath a sky smeared with stars. He took her face in his hands and whispered, "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." She leaned in and whispered, "Me too, even though we started with a towel and a contract. This is where we belonged." The first morning after the boardroom battle, they woke under soft sunlight, filtered through gauzy curtains, and their room smelled of fresh sheets and faint coffee steam. Their hands found each other naturally, and in that touch they discovered something neither contract nor scandal had ever held. They spoke without words, tracing the lines of a future born from courage. He kissed her forehead, and she whispered, "Let's keep building." His half-smile said everything she needed to know. They returned to the clinic, not as CEO and housekeeper, but as partners. Hope grew, between walls painted white and corridors filled with hushed gratitude. They reviewed patient charts, debated rising costs, planned community outreach programs, and every time her fingers brushed his, she felt the realness of his presence, and she saw in his eyes no businessman, but a man willing to unravel his legacy for love. One afternoon, he took her to a small ceremony that he had arranged at her father's hospital bedside. The cancer had progressed, and he wore a crisp suit, replaced his tie with a loose knot, and she leaned over his bed, gently holding his hand. He looked at Marcus as if trying to puzzle forgiveness from hatred, and Marcus nodded and smiled, not rich with money, but with sorrow and sincerity. He told him, "I take responsibility for everything, and I'm sorry." Tears welled in Elena's father's eyes as he whispered thank you and squeezed Marcus's hand. And Elena realized healing was not just medicine. It was truth. That night, Elena held her father's hospital room chair until morning. Slowly, his strength returned, step by patient step, and during that time, Marcus sat beside her, guiding her through paperwork, partnerships, grants. And slowly, Elena understood that his sacrifice was never about money. It was about mending broken lives, including hers. The days bled into weeks, and the foundation launched its first mobile health van, seen parked outside shelters, homeless communities, and rural farms, their names shone on the side. Alna dressed in scrubs and a lanyard, Marcus in his signature gray suit, now more grandfather than tycoon. They high-fived volunteers, gave speeches, and handed out free checkups, and the buzz was more about hearts than profit. One evening, as orange dusk painted their small brownstone porch, they played soft jazz records through a battered speaker. She leaned into him and whispered, "I used to think fear rules this world, but this right here." He looked at her and said, "Love writes new rules." And when she pressed her cheek to his chest, she believed it. Then twist arrived like a letter slipped under their door. It was from Amelia, his ex-fiancée. She wrote, "I heard what you did, and I'm not angry. I only want you to know it reminded me that love is never a performance." Elena read his father's letter again and again. It spoke of regret, pride forgiven, and a shared future, but it also reminded her that forgiveness was a choice, not a gift. She looked at him and said, "I'm scared someone else's regret built this foundation, and I don't want to live in someone's apology." He took her hands and whispered, "This is ours." One weekend, they traveled to her old neighborhood to host a fundraiser cookout for her childhood school. She wore a simple cotton dress, and he rolled up his sleeves and held a grill spatula, teaching kids how to flip burgers. She introduced him as Marcus, and he introduced her as Elena, co-founders of a dream fueled by both their souls. She saw the way he listened when she told stories about grandma bedtime tales, and saw the way the children laughed when she helped them build paper houses. She understood that they were writing new pages, not erasing old chapters, but nothing prepared her for when he bent on one knee in front of those children, pulled out a simple silver ring, and asked, "Will you marry me?" She froze, and tears pooled her voice caught, and she nodded. They kissed under orange fairy lights, and the applause came from neighborhood kids, staff volunteers, and patients. She clutched his hands and whispered yes, and the world seemed to lean closer, as if to witness something true. That night their small brownstone overflowed with laughter, music, soft voices, families, and stories. The media did not cover what happened there, but that didn't matter. Love does not need headlines when it is already home. In the quiet hours they returned to their porch, and he handed her a letter. It was from his father, written just before his death. The words spoke of forgiveness, understanding, pride passed down, and hope for their journey. He closed with, "Your love healed more than a body, it healed a legacy." Elena traced the script and whispered thank you to a man she barely knew, but who had become her father as well. She looked at Marcus and said, "We healed together." He kissed her and replied, "Yes." And in that moment, their love became more than a romance. It became a testament that two broken families could build one full of healing and heart. They stood together in the morning light on their porch, the air still carrying the scent of summer blooms and the quiet hum of a world waking up. Their brownstone was small, but filled with warmth from the day before. The laughter from friends and neighbors still echoed in each corner. In their hands they held a soft ribbon cut from the clinic's grand opening just hours ago, a ribbon that felt bigger than fabric. It symbolized hope, a promise made real when strangers and skeptics gathered to support a dream born of pain and love. Elena leaned against Marcus, her head resting on his shoulder, as she recalled how far they had come from that night, when a towel and a wrong turn placed her in front of him. They had walked through courtrooms and hospital corridors, through memories of loss and burden. They had watched as scandal and legacy threatened to define them. But love had rewritten their story, a love that chose healing over power and partnership over position. She reached for his hand and felt the familiar strength that had held her steady through every test. She whispered, "Thank you, not for the ribbon, not for the clinic, but for believing in us, when our past screamed." Otherwise, he squeezed her hand and said it was her grace, her courage to stay real, that had shown him what mattered more than a name. He said love mattered enough to give up everything to start over, not because it was easy, but because it was true. They closed their eyes as morning birdsong drifted around them, remembering Elena's father's recovery, and how he'd sat at his bedside in the hospital, opening his eyes to see her and Marcus by his side. His smile had said it all. Hope had returned to him, his home, his daughter's new life, reminding them both that healing was the most powerful legacy. Later, they walked through the newly finished clinic, its halls bright, the walls adorned with artwork from local children, butterflies, trees, suns, stars, reminders of light and resilience. Patients greeted them with gratitude, volunteers waved hugs, brought tears of joy. They stood at the back of a small therapy room, where Elena had insisted they start the community art project. She quoted softly, "Love isn't a luxury, it's a cure," and the people there had nodded because they felt it. When the evening came, they held hands at the edge of the shore, salt breeze gentle beneath a sky full of distant lights across the water. Marcus pulled a small frame from his pocket. Inside was the photograph of Elena in a towel, standing at a ballroom door where everything began. The photo had been quietly placed in a golden frame to hang above the clinic ribbon. He told her that photo reminded him that love doesn't arrive with fanfare. It often stumbles in by chance, but when you choose it, it becomes everything. She smiled and said, "It reminds me that bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's showing up even when you feel most exposed, even naked and uncertain. They lace their fingers and let the tide carry their promise. Their love story began in a moment of error and vulnerability. It deepened through truth, sacrifice, forgiveness, and purpose. They had built a life together, not on contracts or titles, but on commitment and authenticity. And in a world built on illusions, they chose to write a story grounded in care and compassion. They walked back inside into the home they had chosen over mansions and boardrooms, and each night they moved through life step by step, writing new pages side by side, and in the end their greatest legacy would not be a name in lights but lives, saved hearts, warmed hope, restored, and the truth that the greatest power anyone can hold is the courage to love without boundaries or fear or doubt.